Good afternoon, seventh grade. World Studies, Chapter 19. We're almost done. Can you believe we only have a few weeks left of school? Okay, so let's see. Where were we yesterday when we left off? Hold on, get over to this slide. We were talking about after World War II, how did the world restabilize and grow? And we talked about the stabilization brought on by the Marshall Plan. That was the United States Secretary of State, George Marshall, excuse me, who came up with the plan to help communism look less appealing to the countries of Europe by helping them rebuild after World War II. We also talked about the European Steel and Coal Community Organization and how it eventually led into the European Common Market that still exists today. The European Common Market are the countries that today make the euro, which is an international unit of money. You can go from France to Germany to Belgium and Luxembourg and Italy and all over and spend euros instead of having to get your money from France changed over to German money and then your German money changed to Italian. You don't have to do that anymore. You just take euros with you wherever you go. It's part of the common market. Okay, but today we're going to move on from there. We're going to talk about the stagnation of this growth, which is really hitting Europe even still as we speak in some ways. We're going to talk specifically about two countries, Britain and France, and how they developed into what we call a welfare state. A welfare state is a country where the people in the country are dependent on the government to support them. Okay, so the country has different programs in place that help support families in the country. Now, I am not against supporting families, but what happens in a welfare state is that you have part of the country that works and earns a living, and the other part is living off of the tax money of the few that earn a living. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more as we go. Okay, so let's talk about first Britain. Britain developed a national health service soon after this World War II. The National Health Service was kind of like what our country has tried to do in recent years, developing a universal health care program for our country. There are a lot of pros and cons to both sides of this argument, but the biggest negative is how much it costs for the government to run healthcare. It's much more effective if we allow private enterprise to run these kind of programs. But Britain started by controlling healthcare in the 1940s and 50s, and then they moved into other key industries where the government controlled things like coal and railroads. And by controlling coal, they're controlling heat in the homes as well as petroleum and other things like that. So they're controlling a lot of parts of the government, and eventually this crippled the economy of Britain in the 1970s. This was all done under the control of they're a two-party system like we are. We have Republicans and Democrats. They don't have that in Britain. They have the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. The Labour Party is the party that wants the government to control everything, and the Conservative Party would rather restore that control to individual Britons and allow the people to control. So the Labour Party is the one who brought in all of this government control, and it crippled their economy. They had such bad unemployment. They were doing really poorly in the 1970s. But then in 1979, they restored the Conservative Party, and they've been doing better since then. Now, recently, they've been going back and forth. They haven't left the Conservative Party in control. They've been going back and forth. And their newest Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is a member of the Labour Party, the more liberal party of Britain. But in all of Europe, they pay way more income tax than we do here. Um, and that is part of this being a welfare state. For example, in Britain, their personal income tax, the amount that they take out of your paycheck before you get it, is between 20 and 45%. That's huge. You think if you earn $10 an hour, you'd only bring home less than 5. Okay, so that is really big. And then they also pay an additional, on top of that, they pay an additional 12% for Social Security. We do that here, but we don't pay 12%. We pay 7.5%. Okay. In France, they have developed into what is called a classic welfare state. With their unemployment is very high. It's very, very difficult to get a job in France. Their taxes are very high. The numbers I looked up said that they paid their personal income tax, where Britain was 20 to 45%, and that's horrible. In France, it's 40 to 60%. So that same $10 an hour would bring home about 4. And then on top of that, they pay 14% in Social Security taxes. So that's even less of that $4. And then when they go out to buy things in the store across Europe, their sales tax is 20%. These are unsustainable numbers. People can't live on bringing home that little bit of money. So what happens is companies pay more, what looks like more on the outside, but because they have to pay so much in taxes, the people really don't have more. And they don't hire as many people. So the people they do have to work extra hard. Okay, some nations across Europe and across the world stabilized and thrived more quickly than others. Germany did, Italy did, India, Portugal, they all embraced democracy and stabilized their governments. Greece, however, had a real struggle. They found themselves in a civil war right at the end of World War II because communist forces were trying to take over the country. America and Great Britain stepped in and helped them defeat communism in Greece. And as soon as they were able to do that, they joined NATO. Now, NATO stands for NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is an international group of countries that their original purpose was to help each other defeat communism. Greece joined that group. They were going to help fight each other's battles for them. This group was very instrumental in the war in Korea. We'll look at that later. Many countries experienced this philosophical struggle between democracy, freedom of the individual people within a society, and communism, where the government controls everything. So both sides are fighting this battle. All right, so let's look at another group that's trying to help defeat, well, I'd say defeat communism, but I don't think that they really did, but trying to help us not go back into World War III. That's a good way to put it. They were helping us avoid World War III, and that's the United Nations. Now, in future years, when we get into world history again in 10th grade, we'll even look at the United Nations in 8th grade geography when we talk about that. But we'll look at more specifics about the United Nations then. For right now, we're just going to kind of do a brief overview. This is an organization that is headquartered in New York City today, and their job is to ensure international peace. Every nation in the world has the capability of joining the UN, but then the UN can tell them a little bit about what to do. Namely, North Korea. They're not interested in joining the United Nations because they're what we call a rogue nation. They do their own thing. Okay, they don't want the United Nations coming in and saying, you're treating your people badly. Okay, so they don't belong to the United Nations. But most countries in the world do have a delegate in New York City that represents them in the United Nations, and their role is to deal with problems that come up in the world and to keep peace between their member nations. The problem with the United Nations, and we'll get into this more in subsequent years of history, but the problem here is that the nations that sometimes cause the problems still have a position in the United Nations. So it's, kind of like sitting down at a round table with the class bully, and the bully has just as much of an equal vote as the rest of us. And sometimes that kind of throws that negotiation off, right? So that's what happens at the United Nations. In fact, the member nations like the United States and China and Russia have veto power. They can make anything that the United Nations wants to do go away. If they say, no, I'm not going to do it, then nobody does. Okay, so that's part of the problem with the United Nations, is they just cannot get much done because 5 nations in particular hold veto power over everybody else. And those 5 nations are United States, Great Britain, France, China, and Russia. So the moral viewpoints are mixed in the United Nations too. I mean, you think about countries like Iran, where it's okay for them to abuse women. It's part of the way that a Muslim culture works, and yet they have as much voice in the United Nations as any other country. Okay, so their moral viewpoints are mixed. And one of the weird things that's come out of the United Nations is they try to discourage things like genocide, the killing off of an entire race of people, but yet they support abortion. Now, do those two things mix? In my brain, they don't. If I'm going to support the right of any group of people to exist, then I have to support the right of the unborn to exist as well. But in the United Nations, they don't have equal ground. So moral viewpoints are often mixed in the United Nations because they try to represent everybody in the world, and that's just not always possible. Not every country in the world has a biblical morality. Okay, that's as far as we're going today. Tomorrow we will start on the development of the Cold War. We'll get into things like the Berlin airlift, and let's see, what else are we going to do? We're going to talk about China some more. We're going to talk about the Berlin blockade, and also into the Korean and Vietnam wars. Okay, so your interesting fact for today to remember is that armadillos have bulletproof shells. The outer shell of an armadillo, it's bulletproof. Interesting fact. Use it on your quiz, okay? All right. I will see you again tomorrow. I hope you all have a great day.